Telling this story, I hope to convey a sense of the obligation we assume by investigating, teaching, and practicing the powerful technology that B.F. Skinner laid the foundations for. Let me give just a little background. The building in which we began our work housed 72 boys ranging in age from 6 to 20 years, most of them between 10 and 15 years. On first entering the building in January 1965, we found the boys just lying or sitting around, most of them unclothed and unwashed. There were no teachers, just caretakers called attendants, who were able to do little more than to see that the boys did not seriously harm themselves or each other. The boys swarmed all over us, picking at our clothing, fingers, faces, and pockets, pushing, pulling, pinching, scratching, sometimes biting, uttering incomprehensible noises, and in general, frightening us all. At meals, many took food from each other, dumped food on each other on the floor, and required continuous supervision. Some had learned to feed themselves with a spoon, but most still ate with their hands or had to be fed. A few could dress themselves, but the attendants found that they could devote more time to housekeeping if they dressed the boys, or just as often left them sitting or standing around the room naked. Well, here we were, a group of laboratory people, scientists, technicians, and students, stepping into behavioral chaos. We had no applied behavior analysis texts to guide us. Ion and Azrin had published an account of their token economy at Anna State Hospital, and I was inspired by a visit to Girardeau and Spradlin's token economy in the Institute for the Retarded at Parsons, Kansas. Except for this pioneering work and a few other exciting reports, our guidance came from the behavioral principles that we had seen in action with non-humans and humans in highly automated, well-controlled laboratories. I'll talk here about only the first few months of our project, January through May, when we learned the most. Our first efforts were devoted to gaining experience ourselves as we attempted to apply principles we had learned in the laboratory. We therefore held frequent conferences at which each of our staff talked about his or her daily activities on the project. These conferences, recorded and transcribed, depict the general methodology we followed, our problems, and some of the solutions we developed. Excerpts from the conferences will illustrate quite concretely what we found we had to learn. You'll soon realize that much of my story is less about the boys than about ourselves. The transformation from scientist to scientist practitioner opened up a new world of reinforcers for our own behavior. One of our first surprises was the discovery that many of the boys were capable of doing more than they usually did. Much of our initial effort was directed at bringing out behavior they already had, but which they had had no reason to engage in. We found that we could accomplish much by simply applying basic contingencies. For example, as soon as we stopped accepting the boys' noises, gestures, and other body language, and started instead to reinforce them for speaking, we found verbal behavior emerging. It had been there all the time, but had served no useful function. What consequences could we provide that would increase and maintain the behavior that produced them? At that time, we were still able to use M&M candies. Our society had not yet decided that dental development was more important than behavioral development. In the laboratory, we had learned to use a simple test. Place a candy in the palm of our hand, show it to the child, close our fist fairly tightly around the candy, and see if the child will try to pull our fingers away to get at the candy. If he or she will do that, even against increasingly tightly held fingers, the candy is obviously a reinforcer. And candy, of course, can only be a starter. Eventually, one has to move on to reinforcers that are socially more acceptable and that are more appropriate to the tasks that are being taught. But it's important to recognize that few of those acceptable and appropriate reinforcers are naturally effective. Just as acts and actions have to be taught, so do reinforcers. A primary task was to develop conditioned and generalized reinforcers. We began with tokens, plastic poker chips. Later, after the boys had learned to save tokens and to understand numbers, we were able to introduce points. For some, points led eventually to money. As the boys saw how pleased we were when they earned the tokens and points that brought them other reinforcers, our pleasure also became important to them, and we became able to use praise as a reinforcer. As they learned more and more, many of the boys found that what they learned permitted them to deal more effectively with their gradually enlarging world. And for them, learning itself became reinforcing. At first, the boys could trade the tokens for candy, and the system caught on quickly. We were soon able to install a store where they could trade their tokens for many other items, toys, self-care items, clothing, coloring books, and so on. Later, our pupils became able to appreciate and to purchase desirable activities: roller skating, going for a walk, using a tricycle, listening to a record or tape, games, books, trips, the company of particular people, and for more advanced boys, private time and private space. Roller skates proved to be particularly effective toys. They were old-fashioned plastic four-wheeled skates that could be used both indoors and outdoors. We first taught the boys to walk on the skates while we held their outstretched hands. The next step was to require them to move a few inches without support until they reached and grasped our outstretched hands. And gradually we lengthened the distance they had to come to reach us. Keith originally tended to move in a fashion that can best be described as sloppy and floppy. When he first put on roller skates, it became evident that he had been paying no attention to the positions of his feet and legs. Within 5 minutes after he had put on the skates, he was giving close regard to his feet, putting them down very carefully, only a few inches from each other whenever he moved. This carefulness seemed to carry over to his normal walking and greatly improved his general appearance. In the first 4 months of the project, the boys made considerable progress in our original program of self-care activities. Although a sensitive visitor to the building was still likely to be depressed at what he saw, most of our boys were usually dressed. Only rarely did one find urine or feces on the floor. Several had learned to make beds and to help the attendants with this chore. Most of the boys now fed themselves, carried their empty dishes to the kitchen, and were considerably more orderly during meal times. Several had been taught to take complete care of the dining room with only minimal supervision, serving food, clearing and cleaning tables, and setting out dishes and utensils for the next meal. They received tokens for all these activities.